Make sure she doesn't ask us for money after this, my daughter-in-law whispered, just loud enough for me to hear as I stood beside my husband's casket, and in that moment, surrounded by white lilies and polished oak, I realized they had already decided who I was without him. I didn't turn to look at her. I didn't correct her. I simply adjusted the sleeve of my black dress, the same one Harold had once said made me look elegant, and kept my eyes on the stillness before me. The funeral home was filled with quiet murmurs, the soft rustle of people shifting in their seats, but none of it felt like grief. It felt like observation, like I was being studied, measured, quietly dismissed. I had been married to Harold Collins for 42 years, and yet, standing there, I felt like a guest in someone else's story. Daniel stood across the room, speaking with a group of his colleagues, his posture straight, his expression composed in a way that looked practiced rather than genuine. He didn't look at me. Not once. Vanessa remained at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her voice low but purposeful as she guided conversations, accepted condolences, and nodded with a sympathy that never quite reached her eyes. It was subtle, the way she moved through the room like she belonged at the center of it all, as if she had stepped into a role she'd been waiting for. I noticed small things. No one offered me a seat in the front row. The chair beside Daniel remained empty, but not for me. Conversations paused when I approached, then resumed in softer tones, as if I were no longer part of the circle they were forming. A woman I vaguely recognized leaned toward Vanessa and asked something in a hushed voice, and I saw Vanessa smile, a tight, polite smile, before replying, "She'll be fine. We're making arrangements." Arrangements. Such a careful word. Such a distant one. I clasped my hands in front of me, feeling the faint tremor in my fingers, not from grief alone, but from something colder, something sharper. They weren't worried about me. They were planning around me. The realization settled quietly, like dust. No scene. No confrontation. Just clarity. I walked slowly toward the back of the room, my heels soft against the carpet, and stood near a table lined with framed photographs. There was one of Harold at 50, smiling in the summer sun, his arm wrapped around my shoulders. I remembered that day. We had driven 2 hours just to see the lake at sunrise. He had insisted on packing coffee in a thermos, said it tasted better outdoors. I stared at that photograph now, at the warmth in his expression, and felt the distance between that life and this moment stretch impossibly wide. Behind me, I heard Vanessa again, her voice carrying just enough to reach me without drawing attention. "We'll need to discuss the house soon. It's too much for her to handle alone." A soft murmur of agreement followed. I didn't move. I didn't react. I let the words pass through me, cataloging them, placing them where they belonged. Not as wounds, but as information. Because that was what this was, I realized. Not grief. Not loss. A transition. And they believed I was the weakest part of it. I glanced down at my hands, at the thin gold band I still wore, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to feel the absence beside me. Then I lifted my chin slightly and looked back toward the room. They were already reshaping the world without him, assigning roles, making quiet decisions, and placing me somewhere on the edge of it all. A burden. An afterthought. Someone to be managed. And I let them believe it. I let them see the woman who stood alone at the back of the funeral, silent, composed, seemingly fragile. I let them think I had nothing left. Because correcting them now would have been easy. Too easy. And I had learned, over the course of a long life, that the most powerful position is often the one no one notices. So I said nothing. Not when Vanessa guided guests past me without introduction. Not when Daniel avoided my gaze. Not when I heard the word support used in a tone that meant limitation, not care. I simply stood there, watching, listening, understanding. They thought this day marked an ending for me. They thought everything I had was tied to the man lying in that casket. They thought I would leave quietly, grateful for whatever scraps of consideration they chose to offer. And I allowed that illusion to settle fully into place, because the truth, the one thing I never mentioned, the one detail none of them had bothered to question, was that everything they assumed about me was wrong, and by the time they realized it, it would already be too late. The funeral ended with a series of quiet handshakes and polite nods, the kind that felt more like obligations than comfort, and as people began to leave, I noticed how quickly the room emptied once the formalities were over, as if grief had a time limit and everyone was eager to return to their own lives, leaving me standing there in the fading scent of flowers and polished wood, watching as Vanessa moved with calm efficiency toward the funeral director, her voice low but confident as she discussed final arrangements, and I realized she had already taken control of things that did not belong to her, while Daniel lingered near the entrance, thanking guests with a rehearsed sincerity that never once turned in my direction, not even when our eyes nearly met and he chose instead to glance past me, as though I were just another distant relative rather than the woman who had raised him, and I felt something inside me settle into place, not anger, not even sadness, but a quiet understanding that whatever connection we once had been carefully eroded over time, replaced by something transactional and thin, something that no longer required my presence to function, and when the last guest stepped outside and the doors closed softly behind them, the silence that followed was different from the one before, heavier, more deliberate, like a stage after the audience has gone, leaving only the actors behind to speak freely, and that was when Vanessa finally approached me. Her heels clicking lightly against the floor, her expression composed, almost sympathetic, but not quite, and she folded her hands in front of her as she spoke, her tone gentle in a way that felt practiced. "Margaret, we should talk about what comes next," and I looked at her, really looked at her, noticing how steady she was, how certain, as if this moment had been anticipated long before today, and I nodded slightly, giving her nothing more than that, allowing her to continue. "The house is large, and we just want to make sure you are comfortable," she said, choosing her words carefully, and I could hear what she was not saying, the implication sitting just beneath the surface, that comfort meant relocation, that independence meant inconvenience, that my place in their lives was something to be adjusted according to their needs, and Daniel stepped closer then, finally joining the conversation, his voice quieter than hers, almost hesitant. "Mom, we have been thinking it might be easier if you moved somewhere smaller, somewhere more manageable," and I watched him as he spoke, noting the way he avoided my eyes. Even now, and I realized he had already agreed to this plan long before today, perhaps without ever questioning it, perhaps without ever considering how it might feel to hear it spoken out loud, and I let the silence stretch just long enough to make them aware of it before I responded. "I have managed just fine for many years," I said, my voice steady, neither defensive nor emotional, and Vanessa smiled again, that same polite curve of her lips that never reached her eyes, "Of course, but things change," she replied, and there it was, the quiet certainty, the assumption that change would happen on their terms, not mine, and I inclined my head slightly, as if considering her words, though in truth I had already made my decision, not about the house, not about where I would live, but about how I would move forward from this moment, because what they saw as concern was something else entirely, something colder, something rooted in convenience and control, and I had no intention of correcting them, not yet, and as we walked toward the exit together, I noticed how Vanessa reached for Daniel's arm again, guiding him gently, positioning herself just half a step ahead, and I followed behind them, not because I belonged there, but because it allowed me to observe, to understand, to see clearly the dynamic they had built without me, and outside, the afternoon light felt almost too bright after the dim interior, the sky clear and indifferent, as if nothing significant had just taken place, and people stood in small groups near their cars, speaking in low voices, some of them glancing toward me briefly before looking away, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to engage, and I did not offer them any help with that. I did not move toward them or attempt to fill the silence, because I no longer felt the need to perform the role they expected, and instead I walked slowly to my car, aware of Vanessa's voice behind me as she began discussing schedules, follow-ups, next steps, all the things that suggested forward movement without pause, without reflection, and I placed my hand on the door handle and paused for just a moment, allowing myself to take in the scene one last time, the people, the conversations, the subtle shifts in alignment, and I understood then that this was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something that had been unfolding quietly for years, something I had only just fully recognized, and as I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, I caught my reflection briefly in the rearview mirror, composed, steady, unreadable, and I realized that the version of me they believed in, the one who would accept whatever was decided for her, who would shrink to fit the space they allowed, was a version that no longer existed, and I started the engine without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore, only what lay ahead, and I intended to meet it on my own terms. I drove home without turning on the radio, the silence inside the car more honest than anything I had heard all day, and as the familiar streets passed by, I began to notice details I had ignored for years, the small shops that had changed ownership, the houses that had been repainted, the subtle signs that time had moved forward whether I paid attention or not, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had, unchanged, still, waiting, as if it had not yet realized that something fundamental had shifted, and I sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, looking at the front door, remembering how many times I had walked through it with groceries in my arms, with laughter in the background, with Harold's voice calling out from the living room, and now there was only quiet, a deep, settled quiet that did not feel empty but observant, as if the house itself were watching to see what I would do next, and I stepped out of the car, closing the door gently behind me, not out of habit but out of intention, and when I unlocked the front door and walked inside, the air felt still, undisturbed, holding on to the last traces of a life that had not yet been packed away or redefined, and I set my purse on the table by the entryway and took a slow breath, allowing myself to stand there without moving, without filling the space with noise or distraction, and that was when I began to see it clearly, not just the house, but the pattern that had been unfolding long before today, the small decisions, the subtle exclusions, the quiet shifts in tone and behavior that I had once dismissed as temporary or insignificant, and now, in the stillness, they aligned into something undeniable, something deliberate, and I walked into the kitchen, my footsteps soft against the floor, and placed my hand on the counter where I had spent countless mornings preparing breakfast, where Harold had once leaned, reading the newspaper, commenting on headlines that no longer seemed important, and I realized that the version of my life that had centered around those routines had already ended, not today, not at the funeral, but gradually, over time, as Daniel's visits became shorter, as conversations became more surface level, as Vanessa's presence grew more influential, shaping decisions, guiding outcomes, redefining what family meant in a way that no longer included me at its core, and I opened the refrigerator out of habit, then closed it again without taking anything out, the action unnecessary, almost symbolic. And I moved into the living room, where Harold's chair remained exactly where he had left it, the indentation still visible, and I stood there looking at it, not with grief that overwhelmed me, but with a quiet recognition of what had been and what was no longer, and I sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa, folding my hands in my lap, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it all, not as something that would pull me down, but as something that grounded me, clarified me. And then I leaned back slightly and let out a slow breath, because beneath the stillness, beneath the quiet, there was something else beginning to take shape, something steady, something controlled, and I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, not to seek comfort, but to confirm something I already knew, and I opened the banking application, entering my password without hesitation, the numbers familiar, deliberate, and when the screen loaded, the figure was exactly as it had been, unchanged, untouched, a number that did not reflect dependence or vulnerability, a number that represented choices, options, independence, and I looked at it for a moment, not with pride, not with fear, but with clarity, because this was the truth they did not know, the detail they had never considered, the piece of the story they had chosen to ignore, and I closed the application just as calmly as I had opened it, placing the phone back into my purse, because this was not something to be revealed in haste, not something to be used as a defense, but something to be held, to be understood, to be used at the right time, and I stood up then, moving toward the hallway, my steps steady, and I paused briefly in front of the mirror, looking at my reflection, taking in the lines on my face, the silver in my hair, the composure in my eyes, and I realized that what they had mistaken for weakness was something else entirely, something they had never taken the time to understand, and I turned away from the mirror and continued down the hall, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to doubt, only a path forward that no longer depended on their approval or their perception, And as I reached the bedroom door and rested my hand on the handle, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by them, not by their assumptions, not by their plans, but by me, quietly, deliberately, and entirely on my own terms. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long moment before stepping inside, the late afternoon light filtering through the curtains in a way that felt almost unchanged, as if time had paused here while everything else moved forward, and I crossed the room slowly, my fingers brushing against the edge of the dresser where Harold used to leave his watch each night, the space now empty but still marked by habit, by memory, by years of quiet routine that had once defined our life together, and I sat down at the foot of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly beneath me, familiar in a way that was both comforting and distant, and I allowed my eyes to move across the room, taking in the details I had not truly seen in months, the framed photographs, the neatly folded blankets, the small imperfections that made the space ours, and as I sat there, the past did not rush in all at once, it unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a series of moments I could finally observe without distraction. And I remembered the early years, when this house was not yet ours but something we were working toward, when Harold and I counted every dollar, when we made decisions together late at night at the kitchen table, discussing what we could afford, what we could build, what we wanted our future to look like, and I remembered the day we finally signed the papers, the way he had smiled at me, not with pride but with certainty, as if he already knew that everything we were creating would last, and for a long time, it did, or at least it seemed to. And then Daniel was born, and the rhythm of our lives shifted. Not in a way that diminished anything, but in a way that expanded it, adding layers of responsibility, of care, of quiet sacrifice that never felt like sacrifice at the time, because it was simply what needed to be done, and I thought of the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, the mornings I woke before sunrise to prepare his lunches, the years that passed marked by school events, by birthdays, by small milestones that seemed ordinary then but now felt significant in ways I had not fully understood, and I realized that for most of those years, I had not questioned my place, I had not needed to, because it was clear, it was understood, it was part of the structure we had built together, and when Vanessa entered our lives, I had welcomed her without hesitation, without reservation, because that was what I believed was right, because I trusted that the family we had created would expand, not shift, not exclude, and in the beginning, everything appeared as it should, polite conversations, shared meals, small gestures that suggested connection, and I accepted them at face value, never considering that beneath those interactions there might be something else forming, something quieter, something more strategic, and as the years passed, I began to notice changes. Not dramatic ones, not anything that could be easily named, but small adjustments in tone, in timing, in presence, the way visits became less frequent, the way decisions were made without my input, the way conversations began to revolve around topics I was not fully included in, and I told myself it was natural, that families evolve, that independence is part of growth, and I did not push, I did not question, because I believed that maintaining harmony was more important than asserting my place. And now, sitting here, I could see how those choices had shaped the present, how each moment of silence, each instance of stepping back, had created space for something else to take hold, something that did not recognize me as essential, something that viewed me as optional, and I leaned back slightly, resting my hands against the bedspread, and I thought about Harold, about the conversations we had near the end, the quiet ones, the ones that did not carry urgency but carried meaning, and I remembered something he had said, not in a dramatic way, not as a warning, but as a simple statement, make sure you always know what is yours, and at the time I had nodded, understanding it in a practical sense, thinking of documents, of accounts, of things that could be listed and measured, but now, I understood it differently, more fully, as something that extended beyond material things, something that included my place, my voice, my choices, and I sat there with that thought for a moment. Letting it settle, letting it take root, and I realized that what had been happening around me was not something I needed to react to immediately, not something that required confrontation or explanation, but something that required clarity, patience, and timing, and I stood up slowly, moving toward the closet, opening the door and looking at the rows of clothes neatly arranged, each one chosen at some point in time for a reason that now felt distant, and I reached out and adjusted a hanger. Slightly, the movement small but intentional, because I understood now that the life I had been living was not something that had been taken from me all at once. It had been shifted gradually, subtly, and if it could change in that way, then it could also be reclaimed in the same manner, not through force, not through confrontation, but through deliberate action, through decisions made quietly, through steps taken without announcement. And as I closed the closet door and turned back toward the room, I felt a steadiness that had not been there before, not a surge of emotion, not a sudden resolve, but something deeper, something more controlled, and I walked toward the window, pulling the curtain back slightly and looking out at the yard, the familiar lines of the fence, the trees that had grown over the years, the space that had once been filled with movement and now stood still, and I realized that stillness was not the same as absence. It was simply a pause, a moment between what had been and what would come next, and I let the curtain fall back into place, turning away from the window, because whatever came next would not be shaped by what I had lost, but by what I chose to do with everything I still had. The next morning arrived without announcement, the kind of quiet beginning that feels ordinary on the surface but carries something different underneath, and I woke earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because there was no reason to stay in bed any longer. And as I moved through the house, turning on lights one by one, I noticed how natural everything still felt, how easily my body followed routines that had been built over decades, and yet there was a subtle shift in the way I experienced each moment, a distance that allowed me to observe rather than simply move through it, and I made coffee the same way I always had, measuring carefully, waiting for the slow drip, standing at the counter with my hands resting lightly against the edge. But this time I did not rush. I did not fill the silence with unnecessary movement. I let it remain, because within that quiet there was clarity, and as I carried the cup into the dining room and sat down, I found myself looking at the chair across from me, the one Harold had used every morning, and for the first time, I did not imagine him there. I did not try to recreate what had been. I simply acknowledged that the space was empty, and that it would remain that way, and instead of feeling the absence as something that needed to be filled, I accepted it as part of the present, and I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle, grounding me in a way that felt steady rather than heavy, and then I reached for my phone, not out of habit this time, but with purpose, and I opened my calendar, reviewing the day ahead, the appointments that had already been set, the tasks that had been left unfinished, and I began to make small adjustments, not dramatic changes, not anything that would draw attention, but deliberate shifts that aligned with the direction I had chosen, and as I did, I realized that control does not always come from large decisions. It often begins with the smallest ones, the ones no one else notices, the ones that quietly reshape the structure of a life. And I set the phone down and stood up, moving toward the study at the end of the hallway, a room that had once been Harold's but had gradually become a shared space, and I opened the door and stepped inside, the air cooler here, the light softer, and I walked to the desk where important documents had always been kept, the place where decisions had been made, where plans had been discussed, and I sat down, pulling open the top drawer with a steady hand, and everything was exactly where it should be, organized, labeled, untouched, and I took out a folder, one I had not needed to open in some time, and placed it on the desk in front of me, my fingers resting lightly on its surface for a moment before I opened it, and inside were the documents that represented a part of my life that had always existed quietly, independently, without the need for validation or acknowledgement from anyone else, and I reviewed them carefully, not because I needed to confirm their accuracy, but because I wanted to reconnect with what they represented, the decisions I had made, the foresight I had exercised, the independence I had maintained even when it had not been necessary, and as I turned each page, I felt a sense of alignment, a recognition that what I had built was not something fragile, not something that could be easily dismissed or taken over, and I closed the folder again, placing it back into the drawer with the same care, because this was not the moment to act, not yet, and I stood up, smoothing my hand over the surface of the desk, and I thought briefly of the conversation that would take place later, the one Vanessa had already begun to shape, the one Daniel would follow, and I understood that they believed they were preparing me for something, that they saw themselves as guiding the next steps, but what they did not realize was that I had already begun to move in a direction they could not see, one that did not require their permission or their involvement, and as I left the study and closed the door behind me, I felt a quiet certainty settle in, not a need to prove anything, not a desire to confront or correct, but a clear understanding that the balance they believed they controlled had already shifted, and as I walked back into the kitchen and rinsed my coffee cup, placing it carefully in the sink, I heard the faint vibration of my phone on the counter, and I turned to see Daniel's name appear on the screen, the call expected, almost scheduled in its predictability, and I looked at it for a moment before answering, my expression calm, my posture relaxed, and when I lifted the phone to my ear, I did not speak immediately. I let him begin, let him set the tone, because this was not a conversation I needed to lead, not yet, and I listened as he spoke, his voice measured, careful, repeating the same ideas from the day before, framed as concern, framed as practicality, and I responded only when necessary. My words simple, controlled, offering nothing more than acknowledgement, because I understood that the most effective position was not resistance, it was patience, and when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the counter, the conversation already settled in my mind, not as something that required action, but as confirmation of everything I had already realized, and I turned back toward the window, the morning light brighter now, filling the space with a clarity that matched my own, and I stood there for a moment, knowing that what came next would not be rushed, would not be forced, but would unfold exactly when it needed to, and entirely on terms that were mine alone. By mid-afternoon, the house had settled into a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as if each quiet hour was giving me space to think without interruption, and I used that time carefully, not rushing, not reacting, but observing the details that would matter later, and when the doorbell rang, the sound was expected, not surprising, because I knew Vanessa would not wait long to move forward with what she believed was already decided, and I walked to the door at a steady pace, opening it to find her standing there with the same composed expression she had worn the day before, her posture straight, her eyes assessing, and she offered a small, controlled smile before stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, as if the house were already partially hers, and I stepped aside to let her pass, watching the way she moved through the entryway, her gaze sweeping across the room with quiet calculation, taking in the furniture, the layout, the details that she would later discuss as if they were logistical concerns rather than personal history, and she turned toward me, clasping her hands lightly. I thought it would be easier if we talked in person, she said, her tone gentle but firm, and I nodded once, gesturing toward the living room, allowing her to choose where she wanted to sit, and she selected the armchair across from the sofa, positioning herself in a way that created distance while still maintaining control of the conversation, and I took my place opposite her, sitting calmly, my hands resting loosely in my lap, my posture relaxed. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to reveal who would break it first, and as expected, she did. Daniel and I have been thinking about what is best for you, she began, her words measured, carefully arranged, and I listened without interrupting, my expression neutral, giving her no indication of agreement or resistance, and she continued, outlining her concerns about the size of the house, the maintenance, the practicality of living alone, each point delivered with a tone that suggested responsibility rather than authority, though the distinction was thin, almost non-existent, and I let her speak, allowing the full structure of her argument to unfold, because understanding her perspective completely was more valuable than responding too soon, and when she paused, expecting a reaction, I simply inclined my head slightly, acknowledging that I had heard her, and she took that as permission to continue. We have already looked at a few options, she added, reaching into her bag and pulling out a neatly organized folder, which she placed on the coffee table between us, turning it slightly so that it faced me, as if presenting a solution that had already been finalized, and I glanced down at the folder but did not open it, not yet, because the act of opening it would signal engagement, and I was not ready to give her that, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to suggest sincerity. This would make things much simpler for everyone, she said, and I noticed the phrasing, not simpler for me, but for everyone, and I stored that detail away, adding it to the growing collection of observations that clarified her intentions, and I lifted my gaze to meet hers, holding it for a moment, not with challenge, but with calm awareness, and I spoke in a voice that was steady, measured. You have put a great deal of thought into this, I said, and she nodded, her expression softening just slightly, interpreting my words as appreciation rather than acknowledgement, and that was fine, because I had no need to correct her understanding, and I reached forward then, placing my hand on the folder, not opening it, just resting my fingers against the cover, feeling the weight of it, the symbolism of what it represented, and I let a brief silence settle before continuing. "I will review these options," I said, my tone neutral, offering neither agreement nor refusal, and she leaned back slightly, satisfied, as if the conversation had moved in the direction she expected, and for a moment, she allowed herself a small breath of relief, a subtle shift in posture that suggested confidence, and I observed it without comment, because it confirmed what I already knew, that she believed control had already been established, that the outcome was simply a matter of time, and as she began to gather her things, preparing to leave, she added one final statement: "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly," and I nodded once more, standing as she stood, walking her to the door with the same calm composure I had maintained throughout, and when she stepped outside, she paused briefly, turning back with that same polite smile. "We will talk again soon," she said, and I inclined my head slightly in response, watching as she walked to her car, her movements precise, confident, certain, and when she drove away, I closed the door gently, the click of the lock quiet but definitive, and I remained there for a moment, my hand resting against the wood, feeling the stillness return, and then I turned back toward the living room, my gaze moving to the folder she had left behind, and I walked over to it slowly, picking it up and holding it in my hands, not with urgency, not with concern, but with a clear understanding that what it contained was not a solution, it was a plan that had been made without me, and as I placed it on the table beside me and sat down, I allowed a small, almost imperceptible shift in my expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, but recognition, because while she believed this was the beginning of a transition, I knew it was something else entirely, and I reached for my phone once more, not to call Daniel, not to respond, but to take the next step that would remain unseen until the moment it mattered most, and I understood with absolute clarity that everything was now moving exactly as it needed to. After Vanessa left, I did not open the folder right away. I let it sit on the table exactly where she had placed it, as if it were just another object in the room, something without urgency, something that could wait, and I moved through the house with the same measured pace I had kept all day, not avoiding it, not drawn to it, simply allowing time to pass in a way that felt intentional, and as the afternoon light began to shift, casting longer shadows across the floor, I returned to the living room and sat down beside it, my hand resting lightly on the cover, feeling its presence without engaging with it, and for a moment I thought about how easily this could have gone differently, how another version of me might have opened it immediately, might have reacted, questioned, resisted, but that version no longer existed, and I remained still, letting the silence settle once more, because in that silence there was space to think clearly, to see beyond the surface of what was being presented, and when I finally opened the folder, I did so without hesitation, flipping through the pages with a calm, steady rhythm, reading each line carefully, not searching for flaws, but for intention, and it became clear almost immediately that everything inside had been prepared with a specific outcome in mind: smaller properties, assisted living communities, financial projections that assumed limitations I did not have, all framed as thoughtful planning, all designed to guide me toward a single conclusion. And I closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table, because there was nothing in it that I needed to consider, nothing that applied to me in the way they believed, and I leaned back slightly, my gaze moving across the room, and I realized that what Vanessa had brought into this house was not just a set of options, it was a narrative, a carefully constructed version of my future that excluded my voice, my choices, my reality, and I had allowed it to be presented, not because I accepted it, but because understanding it fully was necessary, and I stood up then, carrying the folder with me into the study, placing it on the desk beside the drawer I had opened earlier, positioning it deliberately, as if aligning two different versions of the same story, one built on assumptions, the other grounded in truth, and I rested my hands on the desk, looking down at both, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to acknowledge the contrast, the simplicity of their plan versus the complexity of what actually existed, and I reached for my phone, dialing a number I had not needed to call in some time, listening as it rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered, steady, professional, unchanged, "Mr. Green speaking," and I felt a small shift within me, not relief, not anticipation, but alignment, and I spoke clearly, without hesitation. "This is Margaret Collins," I said, and there was a brief pause on the other end, followed by recognition. "Mrs. Collins, I was expecting your call," he replied, and I nodded slightly, though he could not see it, because that detail mattered, because it meant that what I was about to do was not a reaction, it was part of a sequence that had already been set in motion, and I walked slowly to the window as I spoke, looking out at the quiet street, at the stillness that mirrored my own, and I explained that I would like to move forward with a meeting, not immediately, but soon, within a timeframe that allowed everything to unfold naturally, and he agreed without question, confirming details with a level of precision that reassured me that nothing had been overlooked, nothing had been left to chance, and when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the desk, my hand lingering there for a moment, because this was the first visible step, the first action that moved beyond observation into execution, and yet it did not feel dramatic, it did not feel sudden, it felt exactly as it should, measured, controlled, inevitable, and I turned back toward the folder Vanessa had given me, looking at it one more time, and I understood now that it was not something to be rejected outright, not something to be confronted, but something to be allowed, something to remain in place as part of the illusion they were building, because that illusion served a purpose, it kept them certain, it kept them comfortable, it kept them unaware, and I closed the study door behind me as I left, carrying none of it with me, because everything that mattered was already in motion, and as I walked back into the living room, the house felt different, not changed, but clarified, as if each room now held a purpose beyond memory, beyond routine, and I sat down once more, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, and I let the quiet settle around me, knowing that from this point forward, every step would be taken with intention, every decision made with clarity, and that whatever they believed was about to happen would unfold exactly as they expected, until the moment it did not. The meeting with Mr. Green was scheduled for the following afternoon, and I arrived exactly on time, not early, not late, stepping into the quiet office with the same calm composure I had carried with me since the day before, and as I took my seat across from him, I noticed the way he studied me briefly, not with curiosity, but with a kind of professional awareness, as if he were confirming something he had already anticipated, and he placed a folder on the desk between us, different from the one Vanessa had given me, thicker, more substantial, and I rested my hands lightly in my lap, allowing him to begin, because this was not a conversation that required urgency, and he spoke clearly, outlining the current structure of my assets, the accounts that had been maintained separately, the trusts that had been established years ago, each detail presented with precision, and as he spoke, I listened without interruption, not because I was unfamiliar with the information, but because hearing it spoken aloud reinforced the reality that existed beyond the assumptions being made about me, and when he finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that invites response, but I did not rush to fill it, I let it remain, because silence, I had learned, often reveals more than words, and finally I nodded slightly. Everything is in order, I said, my voice steady, not seeking confirmation but acknowledging what was already known, and he inclined his head in agreement. It is, he replied, and then he leaned back slightly, his expression shifting just enough to indicate that the conversation was moving to its next phase. Have you decided how you would like to proceed? He asked, and I considered the question for a moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood the importance of timing, of sequence, of allowing events to unfold in a way that maintained balance until the precise moment it needed to change, and I folded my hands together, my posture relaxed, my tone even. I would like everything to remain as it is for now, I said, and he watched me carefully, assessing, understanding, and I continued, no changes, no announcements, nothing that would alter their expectations, and there was a slight pause before he responded, a moment in which he seemed to measure the intention behind my words, and then he nodded. That can be arranged, he said, and I felt that same quiet alignment settle in again, because this was not about reacting, it was about positioning, about ensuring that when the time came, there would be no confusion, no ambiguity, only clarity, and he reached for a document, sliding it across the desk toward me, and I glanced down at it, recognizing its purpose immediately, a confirmation, a reinforcement, something that secured what already existed, and I signed it without hesitation, my signature steady, deliberate, and when I placed the pen back on the desk, I did not feel any shift in emotion, no sense of finality, only a continuation of what had already been set in motion. And as he gathered the documents, organizing them with the same precision he had always shown, he spoke again, his tone neutral but attentive. When the reading takes place, everything will be clear, he said, and I met his gaze briefly, holding it just long enough to acknowledge the truth of that statement. Because clarity was exactly what would come, just not in the way they expected, and I stood up then, smoothing my hands lightly against the sides of my coat, and he walked me to the door, offering a polite nod as I stepped outside, the afternoon air cool and steady, and as I made my way back to my car, I felt no urgency to move quickly, no need to accelerate what was already unfolding at the right pace, and when I sat behind the wheel, I paused for a moment, looking ahead at the quiet street, and I thought about the conversation that would follow in the coming days, the way Vanessa would present her plans with increasing confidence, the way Daniel would support them without question, and I understood that from their perspective, everything was proceeding exactly as it should, that each step they took reinforced their belief that control was firmly in their hands, and I started the engine, pulling out onto the road with the same steady motion, because from my perspective, everything was also proceeding exactly as it should, just along a path they could not see, and as I drove home, I did not replay the conversation, I did not analyze it, because there was nothing to question, nothing to reconsider, only the quiet certainty that when the moment arrived, when the assumptions they had built were finally confronted with reality, the shift would be undeniable, and I allowed that thought to remain unspoken, held beneath the surface, where it belonged, because power, I had learned, is most effective when it is not announced, when it is not displayed, but simply revealed at the exact moment it can no longer be ignored. The day of the reading arrived with a quiet precision that felt almost deliberate, as if every moment leading up to it had been carefully aligned, and I dressed simply, choosing a dark coat and a pair of shoes that made no sound against the floor, not because I wanted to disappear, but because I had no need to draw attention before the moment required it, and when I arrived at the office, Daniel and Vanessa were already there, seated side by side, their posture composed, their expressions controlled in a way that suggested expectation rather than uncertainty, and Vanessa looked up as I entered, offering a brief, polite smile that carried a hint of reassurance, as if she believed this meeting would confirm everything she had already set in motion, and Daniel gave a small nod, his eyes meeting mine only briefly before shifting away, and I took my seat across from them without speaking, placing my hands calmly in my lap, allowing the silence to settle before Mr. Green entered the room, his presence steady, professional, and he greeted each of us with the same measured tone before taking his place at the head of the table, and as he opened the folder in front of him, I noticed the subtle shift in Vanessa's posture, the slight straightening of her back, the quiet anticipation that she did not attempt to hide, and I understood that in her mind, this was the moment everything would be confirmed, the moment her version of the future would become official, and Mr. Green began to speak, his voice even, his words precise, outlining the structure of Harold's estate, the assets that were to be distributed, the conditions that had been set, and I listened without interruption, not because I was hearing anything new, but because this was the moment when their expectations would begin to align with reality, and as the details unfolded, I saw Vanessa's expression remain steady at first, confident, assured, and Daniel leaned slightly forward, his attention focused, his posture indicating that he was following closely, and then there was a pause, a brief shift in tone as Mr. Green turned to the final section, and he glanced up once, making eye contact with me before continuing, and I held his gaze for a moment, acknowledging the transition, and when he spoke again, his words were clear, deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation, and I watched as the meaning reached them, not all at once, but gradually, the way realization often does, starting with a subtle change in expression, a slight tightening around the eyes, a moment of stillness that replaced certainty with confusion, and Vanessa's hands, which had been resting neatly in front of her, shifted slightly, her fingers pressing together as if grounding herself, and Daniel's posture changed as well, his shoulders lowering just enough to indicate that something was not unfolding as expected, and I remained exactly as I was, my expression calm, my posture unchanged. Because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required presence, and Mr. Green continued, explaining the details with the same precision, outlining the protections that had been put in place, the structure that ensured everything remained exactly where it was intended to remain, and as he spoke, the room seemed to grow quieter, the kind of silence that does not come from absence, but from understanding, and when he finished, there was a pause, a longer one this time, and Vanessa was the first to speak, her voice controlled but carrying a note of disbelief, asking a question that was not really a question, more a challenge to what she had just heard, and Mr. Green responded with the same calm clarity, repeating the facts without embellishment, without hesitation, and I watched as the certainty she had carried began to shift, not into panic, not into anger, but into something more restrained, something that recognized that the situation was not as she had assumed, and Daniel remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table for a moment before lifting toward me, and this time he did not look away immediately, and I met his eyes briefly, not with accusation, not with triumph, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the truth that now stood between us, and I did not speak, because there was nothing I needed to add, nothing that required explanation, and after a moment, I stood up, smoothing my coat with a simple, deliberate motion, and I inclined my head slightly toward Mr. Green in thanks before turning toward the door, and as I walked out of the room, I could feel their attention. Follow me, not in the way it had before, not with dismissal, not with assumption, but with something different, something that had replaced certainty with awareness, and I stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind me, and I did not pause, I did not look back, because the moment had already passed, the shift had already occurred, and whatever they had believed before had been left on the other side of that door, replaced by something they would have to reconsider. And as I made my way toward the exit, the quiet of the building felt familiar, steady, and I walked out into the afternoon light with the same calm composure I had carried from the beginning, knowing that I had never needed to correct them, never needed to argue, because the truth, when revealed at the right time, does not require explanation, it simply stands, undeniable, and everything else adjusts around it.